Hello and welcome back to That Aged Well. And this week I'm joined by Scott Woodard, and we are going to have a bit special episode today. And this is going to be a fun one because we're going to talk about one of my favorite shows, MASH. And we're going to talk about not a show, but the real MASH units that served under the Korean War. And so this is sometimes I try and I like to get to know the interview. So how did this topic occur? How did you come about to study MASH units under the Korean War?
Well, when I was in graduate school, first of all, let me tell you this, and let your audience know that I'm actually a historian for the U.S. United States Army, and in that, everything I say today is my own personal opinions. I don't represent the United States or the Department of Defense or the U.S. Army or my employer, but it's my thoughts and processes and things that I've learned in my experiences and studies. But to answer your question. When I was in graduate school, it was the 50th anniversary of the Korean War, and I was getting a degree in military medical history. So it was like a perfect time. It was like the perfect storm, bringing everything together. Korean War and military medicine. What's the best way to think of military medicine in the Korean War? The Mobile Army Surgical Hospital, and that's how it happened.
So, of course, field army surgery wasn't uncommon before MASH units were created. So let's talk a little bit about, but it was quite different from what we see in the Korean War. So let's talk a little bit about how say the Second World War and even the First World War, and how field armies, if you can elaborate a little bit on how it was were done in the second time before the Korean War, and how much different it would be under the MASH units that we will talk about in a few minutes.
Yeah, of course, when you look at history, it you always have to go back a little bit further to kind of put everything into context. So, with the history of Army medicine for the United States Army in World War One, we had mobile field hospitals, and they were basically this is an emerging transition to the wheeled ambulance and the trucks that we have. In the punitive expedition that was basically a dress rehearsal for the United States before we went into France, it was still using horse-drawn ambulances as well as the horse-powered Model Ts with boxes to create ambulances. So getting into World War One, we have this idea of mobile warfare, and with that, you have a hospital that's also mounted on a truck chassis. And so you have X-ray units, you have mobile surgery units that will progress in theory and in doctrine. Of course, we didn't do a lot of movement in World War II, but we had the practice of setting up and moving in convoys in World War I. And then moving into World War II, the idea of the mobile warfare uh, becomes a requirement when we're looking at mounted infantry and armored troops that are going to move quickly on the battlefield. So what we began to practice, we have two different theaters that I'll tell a story from. In the European theater and the Italian theater, Mediterranean theater, we have groups called auxiliary surgical groups. And they're usually managed at like a field hospital where you have these field hospital platoons that will go far forward to the divisional level areas. And there, a clearing company or a clearing station would be the location for these auxiliary surgical groups or these field surgical platoons to be co-located with. And that actually foreshadows a lot of what we do today in the modern U.S. Army with forward teams. But basically, the life support systems and the ability to hold patients was contingent upon being co-located with another unit because they're just bringing surgical capability, the personnel and the equipment that required. So we see that in the European theater and in the Mediterranean theater. And then on the other side of the globe, in the Pacific, usually in the Southwest Pacific Theater and the China, Burma, India Theater, we have what's called the Portable Surgical Hospital. And so the POSH, as it was called, is actually looks more like we think of when we think of the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. It's like the baby mask. So the POSH is the baby mask. And they're equipped with, at the time, it's all male, And the intent originally is like 35 soldiers, and of those, they're all carrying their equipment on their back. So there's a little joke, at least within American English, where you have armored personnel carriers would carry people into combat. Well, the joke was it was leather personnel carriers. That's their boots, their feet, their soles is what carried all of their equipment into the field. As the war progressed, they would hire local inhabitants to the areas that they were working in, and they would provide the labor to move things because, of course, the way things work is that they get bigger. But they're still very portable and extreme, one would say, because they're not going to carry everything on their back in doctrine. And they would hire people to help carry the load when that was not possible. So you have this World War II experience that builds into the interwar years before the Korean War. But they come up with the idea that, we've got to get further and along in our ability to provide far forward surgical care that is mobile. And so in the interwar year, established in 1948, they began to put on paper what these mobile army surgical hospitals should look like. And that's the development before we get into the Korean.
So let's talk a little bit about developing the MASH units, and of course, because and again, I'm going to refer to a biography. I'm sure you read that one too, Dr. Apel's biography of an army surgeon in Korea, and he talked about how really developed it kind of was early on in the states of the Korean War, because this has just been on the paper. I understand that this was the MASH units. They were kind of just on the paper before the Korean War, so they weren't very well equipped, or they were when the Korean War started. They have no experience of army surgery in the style that we see in the MASH units as well. So let's talk a little bit about developing the MASH units and how, in the start of the Korean War, this would actually go into practice of using the mobile army surgery hospitals in the Korean War.
Yeah, and I would say that the situation we have with the MASH is a reflection of the readiness and the situation of the Army, the U.S. Army, right at the beginning of the Korean War. It is leftover World War II equipment. Most of the folks experienced trying to build in an environment where the United States tradition is after war, the Department of Defense always gets small. And so the Army was much, much smaller, not a lot of experience. Most of the experience, of course, is gone when you have fewer people. And you have old equipment. In the middle of all of that, you have these units that are trying to be built. And because it's a much smaller army, if you have an authorization for a certain amount of people, you're not going to get that full authorization. The same thing goes for equipment. So in the United States and around the world, there were some MASHs established, but they were, I would call it like a skeleton crew, almost like a cadre of trying to get the unit built up. But the same thing is going on with the rest of the Army. It's undermanned, not enough personnel, not enough equipment. And that was the status of the U.S. Army. That's why when the North Koreans initially pushed down into South Korea, it startled folks. And the military, the U.S. Army, was not ready. And the MASHs were just like the fellow brothers and sisters in arms. They're not ready either. So when they initially get into the Korean Peninsula, there's a lot of folks that personnel are coming in from Japan, Far East Command, and it's a struggle at first. Very few folks have the experience of what it is to be in a mobile army surgical hospital, because very few that were functionally cadre that were setting up in the United States and in places like Europe, trying to get this concept from paper to actual application. And it's unfortunately, it was in the battlefield that they actually came and emerged as just like a baby is crawling. Before the war, the baby crawls, but in the war, the baby had to learn to run, and that's what happened.
I want to know how easy was it to draft soldiers, sorry, not soldiers, but surgeons into these MASH units? Because, again, I want to quote, not again, but I want to quote a little quote from Hawkeye in the series, very famous to say, like, oh, I just opened the letter from the US government and then I got drafted. But how easy was it to find volunteers and actual surgeons for, to be put in these units. So how many actually volunteered to? I did not believe that. And I want again, I want to draw from Dr. April's book where he said that army surgeons, they were kind of looked down upon by the other surgeons in the community. So I can't believe there was too much anticipation of joining a MASH unit in the first place.
There's a couple ways I'd answer it. Well, with Dr. Apple, of course, his experience was he was trained during World War II, and the U.S. government paid for his medical school. So in that obligation, if I recall correctly, he was in a Navy,
Yeah.
U.S. Navy program. And there were other folks that were also in U.S. Army programs. But when the time of need came, they said, okay, you were not able to fulfill your obligation during wartime. The war's over, but you're still a doctor, and you're in your residency, as a matter of fact. We're going to call you now to fulfill your obligation. So that's how folks like that's how folks in his classmates from a fully paid medical school, they got to pay the bill by getting into uniform. The other piece was I would reference to Hawkeye Pierce was being yelled at by Major Houlihan, the chief nurse in the series, The MASH, and she was like, I have never seen, it's something to the effect that you are disgusting. I can't believe that you're an officer. What in the world had you come into this military? And his answer was, I got drafted.
Yeah.
And that's my answer to you. They were drafted. They were anybody age 50 and below was put into the selective service system. And so all males during this time frame are in the selective service system, and there are priorities. And guys like Dr. Otto Apfel, he was in the number one priority. They paid for his school, so he had to go. The function is it's a doctor's draft, is what they called it. And a surgeon, just like a baker or a truck driver, they're military age. They have to fulfill their requirement to the U.S. Government, and they're going to be drafted. There's that aspect. And the other piece that you talked about, where the medical community may have looked down to an army surgeon. What you have going on during this time in the civilian community is this idea that you want to have specialization. And so you just can't have the general practitioner or hospital, just a medical family practice doctor. It's all about getting into a residency, doing surgical residency to get a specialty. And so you have anybody who would actually volunteer to be in the Army Medical Department at this time as a medical corps officer or a surgeon, he's competing with the civilian community who says, you come to our hospital and we'll train you in specialty. And from there, you're going to be able to get into very competitive areas and experience. Whereas the surgeon, if he's not drafted in the Army, the surgeon in the Army is going to be more of a general practitioner. And that's where you get into Richard Harberger's idea of you just got to do a meatball surgery.
Let's talk about the term meatball surgery and what goal of a MASH unit were under the Korean War, because that again, this is a term that come up a lot in the MASH series as well. And are we doing meatball surgery? And of course, if you read Dr. April's book, which you absolutely should, it's such a great biography and account of what a surgeon in the Korean War actually did. What is meatball surgery, and what was the goal of the MASH units?
Yeah, the first time I've ever seen that referenced is Richard Harberger was a surgeon in the MASH during the Korean War, and he came back from that experience and wrote about it. He penned it under a different name, but it was Dr. Richard Harberger, and he described what he was doing in the front line in this area. They were like maybe 5 to 10 miles from the front lines. And of course, they were much more mobile in the beginning of the war. We can talk more about that. But his idea of meatball surgery was that's the layman's term of saying, you know what, we're just trying to patch them up, keep them alive, and then when they're stable, we can move them out. Because doctrinally, the mission of the MASH was to treat the patients who were not able to be evacuated. And so if you're coming from a division area and you're coming through a clearing company, so when you go to a clearing company or a clearing station, you're cleared out of the division. So you're moved back to higher echelon of higher role of care. And so the MASH was serving as an element that would take patients who just could not be transferred any further. They were non-transferable is what they referred to them at the time. Non-transferable patients that needed to be saved a life or a limb. And they would be patched up well enough. They would end up saving their lives, but they would be matched up as if they were using, if they were just, and Hamburger's reference, doing meatball surgery. It wasn't super finesse. It wasn't to make you beautiful. It was to save your life and to enable you to travel further. So that was I think that's where that comes from, his terminology in meatball.
So I want to talk a little bit about the mobile part in the mobile army surgeon hospital bit, because it's I believe the idea of a machine as well. And again, we discussed this earlier. There has been field surgeons in both the First World War and the Second World War, but I believe what changed with the MASH unit is that they were so close to the front line, and exactly like we talked about, that they did meatball surgery was when because they were just patching them up and then sending them to the real hospital that could patch them up even more, and then it was kind of like a what's it called, like a factory in a way that's just patched up again and again, on the sending next one in, and but the again the mobile part is that they were close to field, actually close to the front lines, as that no other hospital were able to do. And of course they were had to move everyone, so they never move in the series, but they try a few episodes, but it's they always come back to the original location. But in real life, I believe they had to move quite a bit as well, because the front line changed quite a few times in the Korean War.
Yes. And I would let your audience know that the field hospital platoons and the auxiliary surgical groups, they were fairly close to combat. Not as close as the ones in the portable surgical hospitals in the Southwest Pacific and the China. They were very close, and there were oftentimes where they're doing surgery on their knees with flashlights, and that's in the Pacific area. So they were very, very close. So what you get in the MASH is you actually have a larger group, more people that is mobile with trucks. And initially, it's a 60-bed hospital when they first get into the Korean Peninsula. The intent is to have 60 beds. And so when we talk about 60 beds in medical operations, that includes all the staff that needed support for that bed. So you have the nurse, the ward master, the labs, the auxiliary staff. And so it was a 60-bed hospital that all their equipment would fit in a truck. And so you'd have several trucks, and the hospital was in control of that motor pool, the maintenance area for those vehicles. All the water that was required, all the power generation that is required, that is all part of that unit. And that hospital commander is in charge of all that equipment. So he's not just worried about the x-ray machine. He also has to have oversight of whether the truck is going to work. And so he has officers and non-commissioned officers that are in charge of it. So it's a system. So the entire system is mobile. And what you see is when we first get into the war, the movement of the mobile army surgical hospital reflects the movement of the battlefield. So in the very beginning of the war, you have the ebb and flow where the lines are constantly moving. You have push down into Pusan, and you have counterattacks going back into actual North Korean boundaries. And so with the battlefield moving, the MASH moves, of course. And so you look at some of the statistics, like in 1950, my favorite MASH, is there's three of them that are primarily working during this time. You have the 8055, the 8063, and the 8076. And just raw numbers, they're moving.
There were no 477, were there?
Yeah, they're just in the minds of maybe a studio executive in Hollywood. But yeah, unfortunately, people are surprised to find out there is no 4077. But the 3 or 4 MASHs that were in the very beginning of the war, there's actually 4 that were there. One of them moves 4 times, and the one that moves the most.
And again, if I may interrupt you, there were actually, I don't know how much you can talk about this, but there were actually a NORMASH as well, a Norwegian MASH unit that served under the Korean War as well. And I don't know if there was a Swedish one, but there was, I know there was a Norwegian MASH unit that served with the troops.
Yeah, they call it the NORMASH, the Norwegian MASH. Norwegian MASH, the entire war moved 4 times. There was one MASH. It was called the first, but it changed its name later on to the 82nd or 9th. It moves 4 times from September to December. But the one that moved the most was the 63rd. They moved 23 times from July through
My.
December. And you think about how fast you have to move, and your mission doesn't end when you're moving, and your mission doesn't end when you're packing up. You still have the responsibility of either stabilizing the patients and then moving them to other care. So what they often had to do is what we call the leapfrog. And so you
And
have
I will be referencing. Sorry for interrupting you again, but I will be referencing to the series quite a lot in this episode because it's one of my, and like I said, it's one of my favorite series of all time. But we do kind of see this in the show as well. When they a few times they have to move into the case, for example, we see that they have to stabilize. I feel like this is represented in the show fairly well because they do have to stabilize the patient when they move and the Koreans come. And we do see this a bit in the show as well, which I thought was really nice. A bit of homage to what all the troubles they actually had to go through to move all the, like you said, all the equipment, all the patients, and everything that based on in just a span of a day, or they didn't have much time to move these things either.
hours. They would do it in hours. And they would do the leapfrog method. And basically, they would split their forces and they go forward on the battlefield. Once the forward element is set up and established, ready to receive patients, then they were able to move the next element forward. And either they would come together or go forward again. That leapfrogging method enabled them to evacuate patients and also continual care for the patients because they just couldn't drop them and leave them. So they had to make that plan as well. It's interesting. I know that in the United States, I grew up. I'm a child of I was born in January of 1970. So I grew up watching the MASH series, and then when I got older, I watched the movie. But I was a medical service corps officer in the U.S. Army, and so that is medical operations planning and training of all the administrative things that allow the surgeon to hold his hand out and receive a surgical instrument. I was a medical service corps officer and I did all the planning and movement for that piece.
Yeah.
But my mother-in-law and my father-in-law, they would have no concept of what a medical service corps officer would do. And so I had to relate it to them. I said, you've seen a movie and this TV show Max, right? And they're like, oh, yes, of course, we've seen that. Well, that's kind of what I do. And by explaining that, of course, they thought I was an alcoholic and an adulterer for so many years, just the Hollywood piece that we see in the MASH series and in the movie. But like you said, there are some things that are actually kind of lean toward or some true stories that come from that. And earlier when I said that I was referencing what my favorite match was, and it didn't have a lot of moves in the first part of the war, but it's the 8076, and they call it the Spirit of 76, a reference to 1776 when the United States declares independence from Great Britain. But the commander for that is a guy named Lieutenant Colonel Crider Van Buskirk. And not only is that a cool sounding name, but he writes about the MASH unit when he comes back to the United States, and he goes on basically a speaking tour. But one of the first things we see Hollywood capturing, there was a movie called Battle Circus. And that is about a surgeon and a nurse falling in love at a mobile Army surgical hospital in Korea. So that's an early on movie that takes the story of the MASH. And it was, if you're looking it up now, I think the famous actor who portrays the surgeon, who is like the main character in the storyline. So you've got that precedent set, and then Van Buskirk goes on to talk to soldiers that are coming into the combat at the Medical Field Service School, which is established to train doctors, nurses, and medics going into combat. Because when we first went into the Korean War, if you remember from Dr. Apple's book, he didn't have any field training. It was horrible. It's a terrible experience. And guys are coming back from the war insisting, look, we've got to train these doctors and nurses going into combat. You could be the best surgeon in the entire world. But if you can't live because you get killed because you don't know what you're doing, It's a waste.
And I want to again. Sorry for referencing the show so much, but there is so many stories from the show that I actually interviewed so many veterans from the Korean War that so there are quite a few true stories in the show that actually happened, like 5 o'clock Charlie, for example, which I will come back to a little bit later. But there, in one MASH episode, I think it's in later seasons, we see that I think it's one of the surgeons. I don't remember who, but there's one that has to be replaced, and he is a fine surgeon. But when he gets to the front line in the 477, and he just breaks down because he couldn't handle the pressure of all the soldiers coming in that is wounded and almost dying, and he breaks down. He just can't handle the pressure. So, how many cases do we know of that in real and the real Korean War of doctors that can't just broke down of the pressure of doing? And again, I want to as well talk about it because they had to do surgery for hours, 12 hours without break. So it's quite a lot of stress as well that comes with this because when the soldiers keep coming in, you don't have any choice. You can't take 5 minutes break because their lives are on the line. So let's talk a little bit about the pressure of doing surgery and where, like I said, I don't remember the episode's name, but there is. There was where the and the soldiers like we see, I'm sure you know which one I'm talking about, but where the and
Yes,
the soldiers that broke down like the surgeon did when he got to the 477, just in real life
yes.
Korean
It's
War.
ironically, I just happened to watch that episode last week.
Mm.
And the scenario for the viewers is it's actually a surgeon who is very well renowned. If I remember correctly, he's head of residency at Johns Hopkins, and he had come from
Yeah,
Japan, and he was experienced in surgery because he had been one of the original surgeons that were with some of the infantry units that were trying to push back when they got stuck down the Pusan perimeter in the storyline goes. And so he had experience trying to save soldiers that he just couldn't because of either resources or because of the type of wounds. He was unable to save them. And so go forward in the storyline where he comes and replaces one of the surgeons who's not able to be there. He just basically comes in as a replacement. And eventually, he has what we would call flashbacks, and he's thinking about trauma that he had to experience of working with patients and not all of them surviving, and just being a witness to that horror. And I don't have an exact number to give you from your question, but what I can tell you is that there is a thing called medical fatigue. So just like the infantryman or the soldier on the front lines fighting, seeing enough death, and your brain pushing it off to the side so that you can survive the mission, a doctor or a nurse, a physical therapist who is in a combat situation like that, they're going to have the same thing. And so medical fatigue, this provider fatigue, is something that we talk about today because it is something that we have to address. And basically, just like we're teaching our soldiers to be able to push through things and be healthy about it, a medical professional is no different. Things in history might change. We may go to a battle riding a horse 200 years ago, and today we're going to be riding in a horse-powered vehicle. But people are the same. So personalities, stressors, things like that, people will cope very similar way. So you see that in a surgeon that's going to be at a match. And the TV show reflects that it's a great scenario of showing fatigue of a provider will encounter. And of course, Otto
so
Apfel talks about 80 hours of surgery
yeah.
when he first got to his unit. And coming right in, they didn't even get to say hello. He just went right to work. That's crazy.
So let's talk a little bit about medical advance. Sorry, before medical advancement, I actually want to talk about again. I'm referring to Dr. Apple here because he talked about there were several units that specialized, for example, in head surgery, in
Mm-hmm.
other type. I'm not gonna don't know any of the type of other surgery, but for example, heart surgery, etc. So there were special units, so that specialized in certain certain parts of the body. So unlike I believe in the MASH series, which are kind of were all over the place, they did specialize in the units. They specialize in certain types of surgery. So let's talk a little bit about how the units work together and how these specializations worked.
Okay. Yeah. Uh, Earlier in our discussion, I talked about how the ebb and flow of combat was reflected in the ebb and flow of the movement. So in the very beginning, the first year, they're moving so much that they're just trying to keep up. But then once the battlefield stabilizes and the communist Chinese are fighting now, once we get into 51, the battle lines stabilize for the most part. And so this means that the mashes are not moving as much, but you still have mashes in 1951 that are moving up to 9 times. So that's still a lot of movement. But once we get into 1952, there's only 2 mashes that move twice. Everyone else stays in place. And then after that, there's like 2 mashes that move once in 53. So as the battlefield stabilizes, so does the mash. And with that stabilization, soldiers are always going to try to get more comfortable. So now instead of being on a canvas tent with dirt floor, you're going to start putting wood down on the floor. You're going to start building up sandbags. You're going to start creating prefabricated buildings. And with these prefabricated buildings, these hutments that allow for a better quality of life, better patient care, frankly, better lighting, better electricity, more stable environment. With that also comes the ability to specialize. And so you have treatment centers that are these masses. So they're kind of evolved. And so they start off as a 60-bed hospital. But once they get into the Korean Peninsula, they realize, oh, we got to become a 200-bed hospital. And function oftentimes is what an evacuation hospital would do during World War II. And with the specialization, you have folks that they concentrate their specialists in one area. Or for vascular surgery is one of the areas of it's doctrinally wouldn't be doing vascular surgery to replace veins, but there were doctors who were working toward that. And eventually they get the approval to do this. But that's one of the emerging things that come from the war is an increased knowledge of vascular surgery. It's the laboratory for learning the best patient care. And lots of surgeons are coming back to the United States and saying, if you want to be a good surgeon, you need to be at a mobile Army surgical hospital because that's where it's happening. That's where the boot is meeting the mud. That's where the hands are meeting the blood. That's where you're learning to do this medicine that is quick, saves lives. But they're getting specialized because they're not having to worry about moving on the battlefield. So in the beginning, they're so focused on movement and trying to save lives. But then by 51, 52, they're able to focus on even cold weather injury is one of the locations. You have neuropsychiatry, that's a location. You have actually hemorrhagic fever. You have a MASH that is treating hemorrhagic fever. So what they're doing is one can argue that it's an economy of force to where they're pushing all those light patients to these specialties. So it's the same thing that you'd see in the United States if somebody has a special, they're not treating cancer, but my analogy is if you're in Texas and you need to go to one of the best places to get treated for cancer, you're going to go to MD Anderson, Houston, Texas. Same thing, if you're on the Korean Peninsula, you see, hey, that soldier, he's got a head wound. And the surgeon that's at this MASH, he's the specialist in that. We're going to move him to there. So they have the freedom and the ability to be able to move patients like that. And we can talk about how they did that too.
Yeah, you brought me on nicely there. So the next topic I want to talk about, of course, is the moving about soldiers to the MASH units, and of course the famous helicopters we see in films about the Korean War was used especially for this. So let's talk a little bit about the helicopter pilots, who had to pilot, and it must have been tremendously hard work to pilot it, with a man almost dying on the side and with fire being and the war going on that below you, and you could probably be shot any second. So let's talk about the danger of being a helicopter pilot and it's actually transferring wounded soldiers to the MASH units for a little second.
Well, one of the things that, as far as something that's fortuitous or fortunate for the U.S. military in the Korean War is we were able to have some sense of air superiority. So yeah, we were fighting MiGs. The United States was fighting MiGs, but the advancement of the helicopters, they had free reign functionally. And these helicopters that you see, it's the great listen to the song, and you see the helicopters coming in for the TV show that we all remember growing up. Those folks that were pilots, they were actually forward observers for artillery units. And they would, the forward observer, his job is to pinpoint the accuracy of artillery coming in on front lines. And the forward observers often are with the troops that are there supporting. But in this instance, in the Korean War, they were actually pilots. So you have field artillery officers who happen to also be pilots. They're flying over and watching the pinpointed artillery land and being able to adjust fire based on what they observe far forward of the artillery batteries. They're unemployed.
That's amazing.
Yeah, they're basically unemployed. So the 8th Army surgeon, Colonel Chauncey Devereux, he requests assistance from the helicopter units, the detachments, to say, hey, if you're not doing your job as a forward observer, would you be able to pick up patients? And so that's the beginning of the idea. There were 2 helicopter evacuations in World War II, but it was so late in the war, it was never really developed. It was more of we had to do it for a mission. It wasn't developed to come up with doctrine. But 8th Army surgeon at the very beginning of the war sets it up as policy. And so you have these helicopter pilots who are not trained in medicine, and they just happen to be pilots, but there are other branches. Then the U.S. Army didn't have an aviation branch, so you could be an artillery officer who had to be a pilot. So these guys are mostly artillery officers and solo pilots. And so a patient would be strapped on the side of this helicopter. In the very beginning of the war, they were totally encased. So you can imagine the fear that a patient, if he had been unconscious, would wake up and hear all this crazy noise is inside a box. He feels like he's in a coffin. The Army learned from that and started putting plexiglass over the face of the patient so that when they did wake up, or at least they would have an idea that, no, you're not really in a coffin, but you're going to be okay. The word began to spread, and they began to teach the helicopter pilots just very small bits of first aid. But honestly, the helicopter pilot, if he was to administer any kind of intervention to help a patient that maybe needed an intravenous solution adjusted, or maybe he stopped breathing, the helicopter pilot would have to land and take care of the patient. So in medical doctrine today, we have casualty evacuation, you have medical evacuation. Medical evacuation means the patient is being cared for by medical personnel in route. So one can argue, are these original helicopters that are taking patients oftentimes from the battalion aid station to the MASH in the Korean War, or a regimental aid station to the MASH, is it medical evacuation or is it casualty evacuation? It's kind of a little bit of both if the helicopter pilot is able to administer aid in route. He can lean over and do something, but usually they have to land to take care of them. And a piece of that that's important to understand is when they're moving patients, the patient has to be transferred. So a transportable patient is the idea that he is stable enough to be put on a helicopter. And so by the time the patient gets to a helicopter, he's already been treated in the Korean War. He's already been treated by a medic. He's already been treated by a surgeon at his battalion aid station. And depending on the tactical situation, he may be at a regimental aid station. So all these are levels of care that he's seen before he ever gets to any kind of hospital. And then he could potentially go to a division clearing company or a clearing station where there's surgical care there also. So in theory, there's 4 places where you can have intervention from medical care before you even get on a helicopter to go to the MASH. So the guys who are going to the MASH, the intent is that they can't evacuate them much further off the peninsula, for example. We have to treat them. They will not live unless we treat them now. They cannot live on an airplane getting back to Japan. So they should be taken care of, save their life, limb, at the clearing station, and then from there they'll go to the MASH. Oftentimes, later on in the war, we have surgeons who are making points that we would be able to save more lives in the MASH if you would stop sending every patient to the MASH. Because you have somebody with a broken leg, a gunshot wound to the arm. They would be treated at a cleaning company or cleaning station. There are surgeons there who can provide surgical care. You send them to the MASH, then that means that person is taking up the medical supplies that could be used for somebody with a sucking chest wound. So it's an idea of if you know your doctrine and you implement it properly, you can do really good things with good medicine in bad places.
How many of the wounded soldiers that went through a MASH unit and later, of course, back to Japan and were patched up did come back to the front line again? Do we have a percentage of how many actually came back to fighting after being sent through the meatball surgery?
Yeah, there is statistics, and there's a guy named Leister who has the patient wound statistics from World War II and the Korean War. He focuses on the Korean War. Frank Leister is his name. And so the numbers off the top of my head, I do not know. But in theory, what you do with medical evacuation is you want to have the means of convalescence. And so if they have a wound that they can be treated for and then return back to duty, that's the intent. And so those guys would never leave the Korean Peninsula. If they were evacuated to Japan or back to the United States, more than likely they were not coming back to fight. But what you want to do as in Army medicine, for U.S. Army medicine, the intent is to provide the care to be a deliverer of combat power, which means you're trying to conserve the fighting strength. You're trying to get that soldier back to do his job. So if it's something relatively minor, treat him, allow him to do convalescence, to go through therapy, and then get him right back to the front line. And so once they left the peninsula, normally they would not be coming back.
There is an interesting episode in MASH as well, where you have these kids who are sending letters asking questions to the surgeons, and there's one kid who sends a letter to Hawkeye, not Marvel Hawkeye, but Hawkeye Pierce, where he, says he hates you because he patched up my brother, and he was sent back to the front line, and he was killed because he patched him up again. It was kind of a dark and really deep episode. I would recommend everyone to watch it because because also shows you the physical, how the family were also touched by the Korean War as well.
Yes, that is able to get many stories into one episode for sure, because you have the story of the front line, you have the story of the surgeons, you have the story of the families back home. The former commander of the 8076, the Lieutenant Colonel Carter Van Buskirk, he actually was a consultant for the television show. And, so you have guys like Van Buskirk who are providing these storylines that potentially really happen. And you can see how a family member would be upset if their service member was patched up and had to go back to the fight. And so that's a great example of medical ethics, where you have ethical decision-making process in these scenarios that are exhibited in the television show, and it happens in real life. You have two bad outcomes, and one is not as bad as the other. That's an ethical dilemma. And so the show is showing that, and that's happening in medicine today, in the civilian community, but also happens in combat. So you have to choose the lesser of two things that are not the best. That's medical ethics. And we see that. And of course, they say that the viewers may not realize that it took the series in the movie takes place in the Korean Peninsula, but the subject matter often are referring to issues that are going on during the Vietnam.
Yeah. So the next topic I want to talk about is the medical advancement that were done by the surgeons in Korea, and I believe there were some medical advancement done by the doctors who were served there. So let's talk a little bit about this as well.
Yeah. Well, I mentioned earlier the vascular surgery, and so lots of experience is gained on the battlefield. I think I want to say it was Hippocrates, but all my historian friends are going to tease me if it's the wrong guy. But he basically said that if a surgeon wants to learn how to do surgery, go to war. So you learn a lot. Some things, good things can come from bad things. And medicine and surgery is an example. Medicine and surgery from the wartime scenario. Vascular surgery is greatly improved. It begins, the acceptance of that is going in for the doctrine for the Army. You have the use of, they go from glass bottles used in the intravenous solutions to plastics that enable less weight, easily carried. The use of blood. There is some metallization use of blood in World War II, but the use of whole blood, not just plasma, but whole blood using in the MASH in particular, is super important and is a much better method. And then working with the blood drives using the O positive with universal donor, it puts in concrete a lot of what we're doing today. Also, you see the rapid deployment of the evacuation, the medical evacuation with the helicopter, that along with far forward surgical care and the medics that are trained, those three combined actually foreshadow major metropolitan trauma centers that we see after the Korean War, maybe 25 years later. So it's that idea of the emergency medical system that we build at least in the United States after the Vietnam War. It's just a continuation of what we learned in the Korean War, being able to coordinate evacuation from a roadside injury with a helicopter that has somebody on the helicopter who is able to treat the patient, going to a trauma center that's best suited for that type of injury. Those were those ideas that come about much later. We see beginning in the MASH in the Korean War.
We're going to round it up soon, but I want to talk a little bit about because of course the series focused a lot about the camaraderie in the camp of 477 and how the people got along. And I want to talk a little bit about the camaraderie, and I gotta ask, of course, where is someone like Klinger who tried to get out in the army by dressing as in the women's dresses, and how were the camaraderie, and how after in the breaks when they didn't do the few times they didn't do surgery, and were the food as bad as we see Igor serving in the MASH series. So let's talk a
Yes,
little bit about the food, about how the camp life of the MASH units.
we're just like when the fighting was more stabilized and the living accommodations got much better at the MASH, so did the social hours. So in the very beginning of the war, if you're moving and treating patients constantly, you don't have time for entertainment. And so they're just living day to day. But as the battle lines became stable, then they began to do things like creating an officers club. They would create a tent with movies. The USO with entertainment from the United States would come in and entertain soldiers. And so there were places often in the Court would host that. They would host the VIPs. Um, the In the beginning of the war, they're so busy. But then toward the end, they started doing professionalism and leadership development and professionalism development. They would have groups that would meet to talk about patient status. This were the patients that were on the ward today. This is what the surgery was. And then when they would try to talk about follow-on care when they were able to get information on the patients, they would have these professional organizations that would make medicine better and create better patient outcomes. And then you see the full circle at the end of the war where they're having to go out to try to find surgical experience because there's so little patients coming through. Like, thank goodness for the soldier, but for the surgeon trying to get a better idea of how to do practice as art, it's going to be tougher to find that care. So it's almost full circle by the end of the war. And you talked about the food, right?
And sorry, yeah, the
Yeah,
food, yeah.
the food, of course, we have to remember that those cooks that are cooking the food are
Liver
also
or
the
fish?
yeah they're the same guys. They're part of that unit, so it's not like some another unit's coming in and making that food, they can laugh about it and make fun on the TV show and the movie. But those guys are part of the unit too. So there is some of that camaraderie and natural teasing between different groups. I know even today you'll have guys, if they're from, one state or another, they'll tease each other about their different sports teams or even different branches. They tease each other, but they're all in one unit. Um, I saw a documentary on the Normash, and they said that they got all their food from the Americans, and they said it was really, really good. So at least from the Norwegian perspective, the food was pretty good.
No, no, but I'll just let you. I'm gonna ask the question again. Where the people like Cleaner who try to dress up in the women's dress and try to get out of the army that way, by people pretending to be crazy.
I have not read documentation of people purposely doing that. From what I can see from my primary source documentation, I haven't seen somebody would fit the idea of Klinger. But just like in any environment, in the organization, there's always going to be the few bad seeds that are trying to shortcut duty. And, in the television show, Klinger was a good guy, but they were making fun of the way he was trying to get out.
Yeah.
You did have folks that were absolutely incompetent, and that became a problem.
Rizzo is one of those in the MASH series as well.
Yeah, which one is that?
He's a guy who never does anything and just try to pretend to do something.
Yeah,
And he talks a little
Lloyd.
bit like this, I think.
That guy's still around. Um, from my time in the
Yeah.
service and with my children, that's still around. That guy's still working. Well, he's still getting paid and pretending to work. Yes. One of the things that we were talking about the food and the diet, I didn't talk about earlier, but one of the big things they had to deal with was the malnutrition that they often were faced when they would have South Korean or even North Korean or Chinese patients coming through because of their diet. I'm thinking this because we talked about the food earlier. The food is pretty decent for the Americans, and when you provide it for the patient, it's going to be pretty good. But what they were seeing is the second and third order effects of malnutrition and the disease that's endemic in the Korean Peninsula. You have patients when they would have a gut wound, when they would open up, Apple in his book talks about how it looked like the intestines went and grabbed the scalpel and pulled it back into the patient. Those are worms that were coming about because of either the water or the food contamination. So one of the things that makes military medicine unique is that not only do you have to treat a wound, but you have to treat sickness. And you also have to prevent the sickness in the very beginning. And so a doctor that's in a town taking care of children and grandparents, he's not going to have the same experience as military medicine, where you have to also deal with the effects of malnutrition on the civilian population, as well as the dangers of malaria, encephalitis, and things like that, where you're trying to keep your soldier population well also, because ultimately your job is to be able to provide a soldier who can do his job as a soldier.
I want to talk a little bit about the end of the Korean War as well, because at the end of the MASH series, we see that there are Koreans and Chinese that come and surrender because there is not enough food on their side, and they're not, because they're losing faith. And we see, of course, in Charles Winchester III making a ban out of some of these prisoners of war, and I believe that happened as well. There were musicians who came in and started playing with when they became prisoners of war. So let's talk a little bit about how the Koreans came into these MASH units and began to surrender at the end of the Korean War.
Yeah, I don't know for sure if that exact scenario happened where you're at Koreans or Chinese coming in. Mostly at the end of the war, it's the communist Chinese are coming in directly to a MASH hospital. They'll still be, they're 8 to 10 miles from the front line. So that might be a little bit of Hollywood. And I say that just because it makes a
Yeah,
good story.
that's
I don't
fair.
know if
That's
it
fair.
happened.
That's fair.
Yeah, I don't know if it happened or not. I don't know. It could have. But when I think about it logically, the way the battlefield is set up, that means that they would have to have passed, entire divisions of U.S. soldiers. Oh, not just U.S. soldiers. You have the French, Belgians, you have South Koreans there. You have to pass so many people. Even past probably the Norwegian match, So
But did people surrender? Were the Koreans, maybe not to the MASH units, but were the Koreans, North Koreans who surrendered to the U.S. troops in the way kind of we see in the series as
yeah,
well?
I could see that happening. I don't know an exact scenario. What I do know is they had to separate the prisoners. There was actually some riots in two hospitals, in U.S. Army hospitals, because of patient riots. And what they were finding is in these, because once you're a wounded soldier, you're no longer considered a combatant, so, and so you're treated as a patient. But they would have trouble with what they call the hardcore, the diehards. So you have diehard communists, and then you have the guys who were just called up and got drafted. And they would have to separate them in prisoner of war camps and separate them within hospitals because the diehards were killing the guys who were saying, you know what, we don't want anything to do with communism. You saw the same thing with the diehard Nazis when they were prisoner of war, whether they were Italians or whether they were the Italian fascists or they were German Nazis. When they were in detention or prisoners of war camps, they would have to separate the two factions in order to protect the patients. And so the same thing is going on in Korea. In fact, those diehards are the ones who were causing trouble. And then you had a lot of patients and prisoners who did not want to go back to the North. And so that actually stalled much of the peace process. Actually, it's a ceasefire. A lot of guys don't realize that. But if they listen to the previous podcast when you talk about the Korean War with your guest from the Cold War Institute, Cold War Studies, um, it's a ceasefire. So the war starts tomorrow if you're in the peninsula today. So you had a lot of folks that stalled the process because they did not want to go back.
Mm. Something as well I want to talk about is the aftermath, and of course, and how when first of all, when surgeons came home after serving the time in the MASH units, how easy was it for them to adjust to civilian life, and how easy was it for to get a job in civilian life after serving in the U.S. Army and transiting from the MASH unit into the civilian life again?
It has to be a logical assumption that I have, and it's based upon interviews, based upon primary source documentation. You have folks that had to deal with it individually. One of the things that was really tough when a lot of veterans coming back from the Korean War, not just surgeons, but a lot of veterans coming back, is it's called the Forgotten War for a reason. At least in the United States, when the war ended against Japan and Germany, they were done. And so getting into the Korean War did not have a lot of um, press. It did not get a lot of attention. People were war fatigued. So coming back either as an infantryman or a tanker, coming back as a surgeon or a nurse or a medic, you're coming back to the United States, sometimes indifferent. Uh, there is a book that I read by a guy named Horowitz, and his wife kept their letters and correspondence during the war, so the book was produced by his wife. But he had written her a note, and he said, I noticed that the casualty statistics, and it was a major newspaper, it had not changed for 3 days straight. So the editor of the newspaper didn't even bother to update the casualty statistics. And he said, this is just an example of the indifference that I see in the United States. And so you have that guys coming back with that problem. But you also have guys who are coming back who have been networking. The famous Mayo brothers, the Mayo Clinic in the United States, they're brought in as consultants, and they visit the MASHs in the Korean Peninsula, the U.S. Army MASHs, and they're looking at surgery, and they look at actually the vascular surgery that's taking place, and like, yeah, this is good stuff. So you have that networking that's able to take place where people will come back, and if you are in the surgical community, you know that the guys who know this the best, and this is speaking for the surgeons, they're coming from the best laboratory, the best residency they could have. They've done this. So you have that piece that enables them to find success. And then you have folks who decide, hey, I like the Army as a career. I want to stay in. And so they do that and they progress. And usually there's the guys who are called lifers. And at this time, people have they've either finished their requirement from the draft and they go back into the civilian community. There are a few that say, hey, I'd like to stay in and do my part to serve in the military.
Well, of course, let's talk a little bit about the aftermath and how MASH would, because they kept the MASH units even today it's sustained today as well in modern, we see the Middle East and modern warfare in the U.S. Army. So let's talk a little bit about the afterlife of the MASH unit, and I want to especially talk a little bit about sorry, not Korean War, but the Vietnam War as well, and the use of MASH units there, and how the MASH would develop and change after the Korean War, and how it would change U.S. warfare in a way, in so many ways.
The idea of the doctrine of having a unit that's mobile is still on paper, but what you see in effect during the Vietnam War is it's most of your hospitalization is stationary. It doesn't have to move during the Vietnam War. That is a lot because of the air superiority of the United States forces. We're able to medically evacuate via helicopter for most casualties. And it was stationary and relatively safe. So even a mass that was in the Vietnam War is not moving. So it's not a mobile Army surgical hospital. But the idea of the table of organization and equipment and the models of the MASH, they're still employed in the U.S. Army all the way up until it gets into current operations, which as a historian you never try to keep up with. But there is no longer a mobile Army surgical hospital in the United States Army today. And they've all been replaced, but the same principles apply. So we take the idea of those field surgical teams and the portable surgical hospitals, which were the precursors of the MASH that we see that come to fruition in the Korean War. Those ideas are translated into what was called a forward surgical team. And those are used in the 1980s through the Gulf War and into the fighting in Iraq and Afghanistan, the forward surgical teams. And then that began to be developed further on to what's called a Forward Resuscitation Surgical Detachment, FRSD. And that is taking still the same concepts of providing far forward surgical care, being co-located with another unit that provides the ancillary, providing the life support systems, pushing forward. And so we no longer have a MASH. We've taken that piece of the forward surgery that was part of what made the MASH mobile and moved it out to move forward. So now we have hospital units that are no longer intended to be mobile. Yeah, MASH no more mobile.
No mobile Army surgical hospital.
Yeah, exactly. But the concepts are still the same. And what was developed in the Korean War, the Vietnam War medicine, evacuation, far forward surgery got better. And then, I alluded earlier in our conversation about how they're taking their principles that you see with the far forward surgery, medical evacuation, and the medics or the paramedics. Those three combined, that creates what we see in the modern metropolitan trauma centers today. And at least for the United States, the emergency medical system, EMS in the United States, has Army medicine to thank for that experience and that production, because we had a program called Military Assistance, Safety, and Training, the MAST program. Military Assistance to Safety and Traffic. Military Assistance to Safety and Traffic. It was these medical evacuation helicopters, what we would call dust-off crews, were coming in from Vietnam, taking the knowledge that they had learned about picking up patients and carrying them to trauma centers, hospitals, MASH, and training in the emergency medical systems, working with firefighters and ambulance crews. So now, today, we're driving around in the United States, and I've also seen it all over the world wherever I've been. I've been to 24 countries in the world. You see these helicopters that are flying that are picking up patients at traffic accidents or at houses that are burning, and they're able to transport them to a hospital. That is the second and third order effects of what we're seeing in the peninsula of Korea during the Vietnam War. So it's a great example of, it's not just kept in a little secret if the Army keeps. It is, patients worldwide are going to benefit from getting something good out of something that was initially pretty bad.
I said we'd round it up a little bit soon a little bit earlier, but still thought about it somewhat. But as a historian, of course, I'd rather ask, what are your thoughts on maybe not so much the movie, but the MASH series as from a historian's perspective, and of course, what as a whole, what and personal, both historical and personal view on the MASH series. What do you think?
I think it's good entertainment. It has to be number one. It's good entertainment. So I enjoyed watching the movie as an adult. I shouldn't watch it as a child, but
To be honest, I didn't like it. I thought the movie was a bit crude, and I much prefer the series. Maybe I should have seen the movie first, but the movie
I,
wasn't quite my style, to be honest.
yeah, I concur. It was the free, crazy '60s, early '70s time frame. So yes, the movie was
But they
well.
have a good song though. They have a good intro. The Suicide is Painless live rent free in my head, so it's that's one of the
Yeah,
best parts of the movie.
yeah. Ironically, they used to play that song all the time at like we would have graduations for classes and things like that. They would play it all the time, and then somebody questioned, "Wait a minute, do you know the name of the song? Suicide is Painless. Do we need to encourage this at all?" Of course, all armies all over the world have had to deal with soldiers dealing with um, behavioral health issues or maybe medicating themselves instead of going to medical professionals, dealing with these suicidal tendencies. And so that's one of the things that has been a big focus. And so, of course, you would want to take out any kind of reference to suicide being painless. But I think looking at the MASH movie and the TV show, it's entertainment number one. But if if it just allows a young kid in Norway to be interested in something from history because he liked a TV show, then I say, you know what?
Yeah.
I'm glad. That's good. Because as a former soldier, I can look at a war movie and go crazy and say, that's not accurate. That's not accurate. And it drives my wife
Yeah.
crazy. But if it enables some kid to grow up and want to be a soldier or a historian or a podcaster who
Or
delves
a
into
food
history,
server.
yeah. There's even a Seinfeld reference about George Costanza's father being a cook during the Korean War.
Yeah,
So
that's
it's
right.
still
Yeah.
it goes out to all of whether it's popular culture or getting people interested in whether it's history or military medicine. You know, I'm all for it. But there are of course some things that are true, and there's some things that are not true. And the fun part is finding out
And
which one is real.
mm, I like I said, I don't remember if I said it earlier, but the writers of MASH, and there is some podcast called MASH Matters, which goes into this topic, the MASH series, and they talked about how the writers they actually interviewed veterans from
Yeah,
MASH units, and some of them there's so many stories in the series are very real stories that happened. Like I said earlier, 5 o'clock Charlie was a real story about that. Well, they call him Bedchuck Charlie, and again, it's in Doctor April's book. I think so. There are
yeah,
it's so fun to see that how they actually try to not sure some comedy to some extent that would get more serious later in the seasons, but it's also represents so much of the real history behind the MASH unit, and the MASH was pretty much up until the movie, I believe, a fairly unknown part, and still kind of is an unknown and hidden part of the Korean War. So I think it's really helped shine a light on the unsung heroes, to put it that way, in the Korean War, and how the MASH units actually helped not just save life but advance the army, military, and advancement as well during the Korean War.
yeah. And it's also, you sometimes think, is Hollywood representing society or is now society representing Hollywood? And some of, the doctors and nurses, physician assistants, they're coming in from a clinical background. And so people laugh and say, oh my gosh, that's a doctor in uniform or that's a nurse in uniform. And so to be surviving on the battlefield, you need to know your tactics. You need to know how to be a soldier also. But there's also that irreverent idea of clinical personnel are kind of different. And so today, even you see medical personnel taking on that persona of Hawkeye, where he's kind of flippant
Yeah.
making fun of the regular Army guys. But in essence, everybody here is in the Army today is regular Army because nobody's drafted in the U.S. Army today. And so you kind of take on that genre of whatever else they want to call it, that personality.
I have one last question about that actually, because I was trying to ask it earlier, but I kind of forgot about it because we were so deep in the conversation. But how had you referenced Hawkeye being this lax anti-army guy? But how was it kind of like this in real mass units, where was there the lack of military discipline, and or were the people that front person were very strict military and military through and through, and but how strict were the military discipline in the MASH units?
I think those are examples of two extremes, and two extremes would exist. You have guys who are the lifers who've come in from military tradition, have been World War II veterans. And then you have guys who were drafted and they didn't have a choice. And so you have both extremes coming in. What I've read from reports is the biggest problem that's coming about is, at least from what I've seen from official reports, it's not the indifference or the flippant attitude, but it's competency and technical training. And you see a lot of that. You have doctors that are coming in, and they have to learn how to be good surgeons. And that's, for the most part, they are. You have nurses coming in who are having to train the medics because they don't have the technical skills initially on in the very beginning of the war to be able to handle the caseloads that they should, working in the wards or in the operating room. So it's a lot of the commanders have problems with the technical training and the actual field acumen. It's like just beginning where you saw Apple talking about he didn't have any field training. That's an issue for across the board for everybody. So the technical training and being able to masters of their technical skills, particularly in the enlisted branches, and then the field acumen, being able to survive in combat. That was an issue for the commanders. I haven't seen anything about a flippant attitude or the Hawkeye Pierce. It was more like they can't do their job. And so that's where you got people concerned.
And I remember one quote when Apple came into the army, to the third MASH unit, 806, I think it's 863rd, and he asked about, can I do a 5-minute break? And the guy said, sure, you can take a break, but think about the victim lying there, that the next victim that comes in. And, that quote kind of stuck with me, and I can't imagine standing doing 12 to 20 hours surgery straight in, without even a 5 minute break, because the bodies keep coming in.
Yeah, and it was a tough experience. One thing that I actually forgot to mention when you talked about some of the things that improved from the Korean War, I don't want to leave the conversation here without addressing how much X-rays were used. So the radiographs, using X-rays to determine where shrapnel bullets were in the patient, that allowed for better debridement, being able to treat the patients quicker. That was another great thing that came about from the MASH. And then, we can talk about Major Houlihan, and you can talk about Captain Pierce. Two different types of personalities in the show and in the movie. But one thing that I always try to leave people with the idea is that when we look around the room today in the U.S. Army, and I see female nurses, we have male nurses, we have female medics, we have male medics. But we don't even give it a second thought today. But when they look back, and I say, when you look back and you look at anything from Vietnam back, every woman in uniform there is a volunteer. The men, more than likely, were drafted.
Think about that for a second. Just think about it.
Yeah, and that's what I had them do. And I have a lot of students, whether they're captains or majors, or whether or not they're specialists or sergeants. They look around and they're like, man, I don't even think about that anymore. I said, yeah, your mom or your grandmother that served in the military, they did it. They volunteered. Your grandfather or your dad, they may have been drafted. More than likely, they could have been drafted. Statistically, that's the way you think about that. And so what those women during the Korean War, the Army Nurse Corps only allowed women to be commissioned. That changes much later. But those women were all volunteers. And so, man, we don't even think about that at all today. But back then, that was a huge deal. and we need to recognize that.
I think yeah, well, obviously, and I should make an episode about that in the future as well, about women in the army, not just MARSH, but army, but in the army generally, and women and nurses. But I think we're gonna round it up now. Of course, thank you for coming on. If you, before you go, it's been a great pleasure to have you on here, of course, and I really enjoyed talking about this topic because it's a topic I wanted to cover for a long time, and. Before you go, of course, do you have anything you want to promote? Where can people find you if they have further questions about the MASH units or the Korean War on medical army equipment in the Korean War? And of course, if people want to read about MASH units, what would you recommend topics if they want to do further research on this? Of course,
Actually,
the shit.
well, you know, when you talk to my colleague about trying to get resources for this discussion, he was like, well, you know what? You need to talk to my colleague Woody, because that's what he wrote his master's thesis on. So I actually, I would share with you that there's a book that the Borden Institute put out, and it's called The Evolution of Forward Surgery in the U.S. Army. And chapter 7 is about the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. So I wrote that actually chapter. So that's just some of what I've done, and it speaks to primary source material about the Mobile Army Surgical Hospital. So we scratched the surface today in the last hour or so. But what I tell members of the Army Medical Department is that we as historians, my group is called the U.S. Army Medical Department Center of History and Heritage. And we are embedded as special staff to the U.S. Army Medical Center of Excellence, which our mission is to train those soldiers in their medical and clinical skills and also in their battlefield skills. And we as special staff, we provide the insight as to the historical context. And if people are in the U.S. Army wanting to know their Army medical history, that's what our section's for. And so telling the story of Army medicine, like I've done today, is part of what we do. So, the easiest thing is to just go to a search engine and look up Army medicine. We have different podcast, Facebook page presence, Instagram, things like that. But Army medicine, U.S. Army Medical Department Center of History and Heritage, that's just some of the buzzwords you can use to find us. But I feel blessed. I get to do my hobby as my job. It's the best job in the world.
Again, thank you so much for coming on. It's been great fun today to talk with you. And this has been With That Aged Well. You can find us on social media on the Twitter/X under With That Aged Well. We're also on Blue Sky under the same name and Instagram as well, all under With That Aged Well. You can find us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, YouTube, wherever you can find podcasts these days. If you are on Spotify, of course, consider giving us 5 stars. Or if you hated this episode, you can give us 1. It's a free world, at least for now. And if you are on Apple Podcast, you can give us a review, write a review, and if I find it, I will try to read it on the podcast. I love seeing reviews, and if you are on YouTube, of course, leave a comment. See what do you think about MASH units and, of course, the TV series. Do you have a favorite episode, perhaps? You can also leave a comment on Spotify. Leave a comment about your favorite MASH moment in the TV series. And my name's Alan. This has been With That Aged Well. Please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time.